The night Jane Hayes's daughter stopped breathing right, the only person who came was a stranger. She had been in Caldwell, Kansas for exactly 43 days when the fever took hold of little Clara, and in those 43 days she had learned one very clear truth about the frontier. The land did not care whether you lived or died, and neither did most of the people on it. The year was 1878, and Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a splinter lodged in rough skin, a cattle town full of drovers and gamblers and men who smelled of horses and whiskey and dust. It was not the kind of place a widow woman with a 6-year-old child ought to be building a life, but Jane had nowhere else to go, and she had long since stopped waiting for life to hand her better options. She had come from Missouri after her husband, Thomas Hayes, had died of a burst appendix in the spring. He left her with $40, a small trunk of clothing, a mule that went lame 3 weeks into the journey west, and Clara. That was the full accounting of her inheritance. She had sold the mule to a farmer outside of Wichita and used the money to buy passage on a freight wagon the rest of the way south to Caldwell, where she had heard from a woman at a church social that there was work to be found for a woman willing to cook and clean. She found it at the Sunrise boarding house, run by a hard-eyed woman named Mrs. Abernathy, who paid her $4 a week and allowed her to keep Clara in the small back room that smelled of lye soap and old wood. Clara was a quiet, serious child with her father's brown eyes and her mother's stubbornness. She had taken the move from Missouri with a sort of stoic resignation that Jane found both admirable and heartbreaking in a 6-year-old. She did not cry for her father anymore, at least not where Jane could see her. She helped carry water buckets and folded linens with the careful precision of a child who understood that the world required something of you in exchange for letting you exist in it. The fever came on a Tuesday, the way disaster always comes, ordinary and without warning. Clara had been helping Jane fold sheets in the backyard of the boarding house when Jane noticed her daughter's cheeks were flushed and her eyes had gone glassy. She pressed her palm to Clara's forehead and felt the heat radiating off her skin like a small stove, and her stomach dropped. She got Clara into bed and sent word to the only doctor in Caldwell, a man named Dr. Pruitt, who arrived 2 hours later smelling of pipe tobacco and something stronger. He examined Clara with the distracted efficiency of a man who had seen too much of the world to be alarmed by any particular piece of it, and he told Jane the fever was bad but not yet critical, that she should keep the child cool with wet cloths, give her sips of water, and pray it broke by morning. He left a small bottle of laudanum in case the pain became unbearable, charged Jane 50 cents she could barely spare, and walked back out into the Caldwell night as casually as if he had simply stopped by for a social call. Jane sat with Clara through the afternoon and into the evening, changing the cloths on her forehead, whispering to her, singing the soft Missouri songs that Clara had loved as a toddler. Mrs. Abernathy stopped in once to say that she hoped the child would be better soon, and that she trusted Jane would still be able to manage the morning breakfast service. Jane said yes, ma'am, and meant neither the words nor the pleasantness with which she delivered them. By 9 o'clock that night, Clara was worse. The fever had climbed. Clara was no longer responding clearly to Jane's voice, drifting in and out of a restless, thrashing half-sleep that frightened Jane more than any outright crying would have. Her small body was burning up, and her breathing had taken on a shallow, rapid quality that made Jane's chest tight with a fear so physical it felt like a hand squeezing her heart. She needed more wet cloths. She needed the bucket of water she kept by the door, and it was empty, and the well was on the other side of the boarding house yard, and she did not want to leave Clara alone even for 5 minutes. She stood in the doorway of their small room, looking out into the dark corridor of the boarding house, and she felt as utterly alone as she had ever felt in her entire life. It was in that moment that she heard boots on the back porch. She stepped out and found herself looking at a man she had seen a handful of times in the dining room of the boarding house, a trail hand who had been staying for the past week, while his outfit rested their horses before the long push back up the trail. He was tall in the way that men who spent their lives outdoors tended to be tall, lean and hardened by weather, with dark hair pushed back under a battered hat, and eyes the color of deep creek water in summer, somewhere between gray and green, in a way that shifted depending on the light. He was perhaps 29 or 30, with a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days and hands that were calloused from rope work. His name was Louis Redmond. She knew that from the boarding house register, and because Mrs. Abernathy had mentioned him once as one of the trail hands who actually paid on time and did not break the furniture. He was coming in from the direction of the stable, and he stopped when he saw her standing in the doorway looking pale and frightened and clutching the empty bucket like it was the only solid thing in the world. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "everything all right?" "My daughter," Jane said, and her voice cracked on the second word in a way she had not intended. She cleared her throat. "She is sick. The fever is very bad tonight. I need water from the well, but I cannot leave her." Louis Redmond looked at her for 1 second. Then he reached out and took the bucket from her hand without a word, turned and walked to the well. She watched him work the pump handle, the water sloshing into the bucket, and then he came back and handed it to her. "Thank you," she said. "Is the doctor coming back?" he asked. "He already came. He said to keep her cool and wait." She heard the bitterness in her own voice and did not try to hide it. Louis looked at the bucket, then at her face, then at the door behind her. "How high is the fever?" he asked. "Very high. She is not making sense when she talks. Her breathing is fast." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My mother used to put a damp cloth at the back of the neck, not just the forehead. Said it worked better. And she would give them cold water to drink in small sips, just a little at a time, so they could keep it down." Jane stared at him. "Your mother was a nurse?" "No, ma'am," he said simply. "She just raised 6 children on the Texas plains, and there was not always a doctor to be had." Something in those words, the plainness of them, the honesty of the hardship they described, cut through the fear and exhaustion that had been pressing down on Jane all evening, and she felt her eyes sting unexpectedly. "I should get back into her," she said, pressing her lips together. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And then quietly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, "Do you want another pair of hands? I don't have anywhere to be tonight." She looked at him. He was a stranger. He was a trail hand she had exchanged perhaps 20 words with over the course of a week. But she was alone, and her daughter was burning up, and the night was very long, and Louis Redmond's face in that moment held the most genuine and uncomplicated kindness she had seen since Missouri. "All right," she said. He came inside. He settled into the wooden chair by the window without being asked, while Jane knelt beside Clara's narrow cot and began changing the cloths. Clara stirred at her mother's touch, her eyes opening partway, glassy and unfocused. "Mama," she said in a small, cracked voice. "I'm right here, sweetheart," Jane said, keeping her voice steady through the effort of will. "You're going to be fine." Clara's eyes drifted to Louis, sitting in the chair. "Who is that man?" she whispered. "His name is Mr. Redmond," Jane said. "He is a friend." Clara considered this with the brief, serious concentration of a feverish child. "He has a big hat," she said, and then her eyes closed again. Louis quietly removed his hat and set it on the floor beside his chair. They settled into the rhythm of the long night. Jane changed the cloths every 20 minutes, keeping them cool, placing them now on Clara's forehead and at the back of her neck as Louis had suggested. She gave her small sips of water. Louis kept the lamp trimmed and burning at just the right level, not too bright to disturb Clara's fitful sleep, not so dim that Jane could not see what she was doing. When Jane's hands began to tremble from exhaustion and fear somewhere around midnight, Louis rose without comment, dipped a fresh cloth in the cool water, and handed it to her. He did not talk much, and she was grateful for that. What she needed was not conversation. What she needed was presence, and he provided it in a way that felt somehow entirely natural, as if he had always been the sort of man who understood the difference between being helpful and being intrusive. At one point, around 2 in the morning, Clara's breathing became so labored, and her temperature seemed to spike so sharply that Jane's composure finally cracked entirely. She pressed her hand over her mouth and turned her face toward the wall because she did not want to frighten Clara with the sound of her own terror. She heard Louis move, heard the sound of the water bucket, and then felt a cool, damp cloth pressed gently but firmly against the back of Clara's neck, and she heard his low, quiet voice saying, "It's all right. The fever's fighting. That means her body is working." "How do you know that?" Jane asked, her voice still muffled against her hand. "I don't know it for certain," he said honestly, "but I believe it. I've seen fever break before. It gets worse before it turns." She turned back to face him then, and his eyes were steady and direct and entirely without false comfort. He believed what he said. That was what made it bearable. She straightened. She dipped another cloth. She kept going. At 3:30 in the morning, Clara opened her eyes and asked for water in a voice that was weak but recognizably clear. Jane gave it to her in small sips, and when Clara finished she looked up at her mother and said, "I'm cold, Mama." Jane pressed her hand to her daughter's forehead. The fever had broken. She sat back on her heels and felt the relief move through her body like water released from a dam, profound and almost violent in its intensity. Her eyes closed. She pressed her knuckles to her mouth and breathed. "It broke," Louis said from the chair. "Yes," Jane managed. She pulled the extra blanket up over Clara and tucked it around her small shoulders, and Clara was already drifting into what looked, for the first time all night, like genuine restful sleep. Jane straightened up and turned to look at Louis Redmond, sitting in the wooden chair in the lamplight with his battered hat on the floor beside him and his elbows on his knees, watching her with those deep-water eyes. She did not know what to say. Thank you felt too small for what he had done, sitting through the terror of that whole long night beside a woman he barely knew and a child he had never met, and she suspected he would deflect it anyway. He seemed to read something in her silence because he simply picked up his hat and stood. "She'll need rest and plenty of water tomorrow," he said, "and something light to eat when she can manage it." "Mr. Redmond," Jane said. "Louis," he said, "if you don't mind." "Louis," she said. The name sat strangely in her mouth, not unpleasantly, just unfamiliar in the specific way that something new and important sometimes feels. "I don't have the right words." "You don't need them," he said simply. He settled his hat on his head. "Good night, Mrs. Hayes." He walked out into the gray pre-dawn quiet, and Jane stood in the doorway listening to his boots cross the back porch, and she thought that in her 27 years of living she had never met a man quite like that before. Clara slept until noon the following day and woke up asking for biscuits, which Jane took as a sign from God that everything was going to be fine. Over the next several days, as Clara recovered steadily, Jane found herself aware of Louis Redmond in a way she had not been before. She had noticed him, of course, the way you notice anyone who shares a dining room with you for a week, but now she noticed him differently. She noticed the way he held his coffee cup in the morning, both hands wrapped around it as if he were drawing warmth from it. She noticed the way he thanked Mrs. Abernathy's cook, a woman named Pearl, with genuine courtesy every time a plate was set in front of him, something few of the other trail hands bothered with. She noticed the way he listened when other people spoke, with a quality of full attention that was remarkably rare. She also noticed that he said nothing to anyone about what he had done. He did not mention it to the other boarders. He did not bring it up in the dining room. He did not seek her out for acknowledgement or gratitude or any of the social currency that most people expected in exchange for a significant favor. He simply continued his days as he had before, except that now when he passed her in the corridor or the yard, he nodded with a warmth that had not been there in the nodding before. And once, when he saw her carrying a heavy load of laundry out to the yard, he crossed to her and took half the load without being asked and carried it to the washing line. And when she thanked him, he just said, "Of course," and went back to whatever he had been doing. She thought about him more than she felt entirely comfortable thinking about him. It had been less than 6 months since Thomas died. She was not the kind of woman who forgot her husband easily, or who moved from grief to something else without fully passing through the grief first. She had loved Thomas in the particular way that people love the person who was there at the beginning of their adult lives, the person who was present when Clara was born, the person whose absence left a shape in the daily fabric of her existence that she was still learning to account for. But grief, she was discovering, did not make you stop being a living woman. It just made you feel guilty about it when you remembered. On a Saturday afternoon, 10 days after Clara's fever, Jane was sitting on the back porch of the boarding house mending a shirt while Clara played in the dust of the yard, making a small town out of sticks and pebbles with the focused creativity of a child whose imagination had returned full force along with her health. Jane heard boots on the steps and looked up to find Louis, hat in hand, coming around the corner of the porch. "Afternoon," he said. "Afternoon," she said. He stood there a moment, looking at Clara in the yard, who had constructed what appeared to be a cathedral out of sticks and was now populating it with pebble citizens. "She looks well," he said. "She is well," Jane said, and felt the gratitude surge up in her again. "Because of what you did. Dr. Prewitt and her own constitution did the work," he said, with a dismissiveness that was not false modesty but genuine deflection, as if taking credit for it would somehow diminish the thing itself. Jane set down her mending. "Louis," she said, and his name in her mouth was already easier than it had been a week ago. He looked at her. "Will you sit down?" she said. "I don't bite, and the porch is wide enough." Something in his expression shifted, a slight relaxation, as if he had been holding himself to a formal posture and had just been given permission to let it go. He settled into the other chair on the porch, hat balanced on his knee, and for a while they just sat there together in the warm Kansas afternoon watching Clara build her miniature civilization. "Where are you from?" she asked. "Texas," he said. "Hill country originally. Family had land there. I've been trailing cattle since I was 17. "That's a long time on the road," she said. "It's a long time," he agreed. "I don't mind the moving. I used to not mind it anyway." He paused. "What about you?" "You're not from Kansas." "Missouri," she said. "A small town outside of Independence. Thomas and I were married there. He was a clerk at a dry goods store." She stopped, listening to herself describe her former life in the past tense, which still had a way of catching her off guard. "He died in April, appendix." "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. She could hear that he meant it. "We didn't have enough saved to stay," she said. "The house was rented. The store wouldn't keep the job. I heard there was work here." She looked at her hands. "I didn't know what else to do, so I came." "That's courage," he said. She looked at him. "I was frightened every step of the way." "That's still courage," he said. "Frightened people who do the thing anyway are the only kind of courageous people there are." Clara had looked up from her stick cathedral and was watching Louis with the frank, unfiltered assessment of a 6-year-old. "Mr. Redmond," she called from the yard. Louis looked over. "Yes, Miss Clara." "Do you want to see my town?" she asked, with the specific dignity of a child extending a very serious invitation. Louis stood up, settled his hat back on his head, and walked down the porch steps into the yard with the same matter-of-fact willingness with which he did everything. He crouched down in the dust beside Clara's construction and let her explain every stick and pebble to him with complete solemnity, and he asked questions. Real questions. What is this building for? Who lives in this house? Why does this one have a fence and not the others? Jane sat on the porch and watched this man, this lean, dusty trail hand with the quiet eyes and the calloused hands, crouched in the dirt of a boarding house yard listening to a 6-year-old girl explain the governance structure of her stick town, and she felt something move in her chest that she was not entirely prepared for. She picked up her mending and tried to concentrate on it. She did not entirely succeed. Louis's outfit was due to pull out of Caldwell in 3 more days. She knew this because she had heard them talking about it in the dining room, the trail boss laying out the schedule while the hands ate their supper, and she had felt a small, sharp pull of dismay at the information that she had firmly told herself was entirely unreasonable. She did not see him the following day, which was a Sunday, because he rode out with several of the other hands to look at some horses a rancher outside of town was selling. On Monday, she saw him briefly at breakfast, and they exchanged the particular look of two people who are both aware that time is running short, but neither has yet addressed that fact directly. On Monday evening, she was in the kitchen helping Pearl with the washing up after supper when Louis appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "would you want to take a walk, if you can be spared here?" Pearl gave Jane a look that communicated a great many things in the compact and efficient language of women who understood each other, took the dishcloth from her hands and said, "Go on, then." They walked out into the Caldwell evening. The town was alive the way cattle towns were alive in 1878, rough and loud and smelling of horses and cook fires, and the particular quality of dust that the Kansas wind raised and never quite put back down. They walked away from the louder part of Main Street toward the quieter edge of town where the buildings gave way to open land and the sky came down big and full of early stars. "You leave day after tomorrow," Jane said. "Yes," he said, "back to Texas." "The outfit goes back to Texas. After that, I'm not sure." He was quiet for a moment. They walked side by side with a few inches of proprietary distance between them, and she was aware of that distance in a way she had not been aware of space between herself and another person in a very long time. "There's a spread in the hill country I've had my eye on. Small piece of land. Not much yet, but it could be something." "You want to stop trailing?" she asked. "I've been trailing cattle since I was 17, he said again. "I'm 30 now. That's 13 years of sleeping on the ground and eating dust." He looked sideways at her. "There comes a point where a man starts wanting something he can come back to." The words settled between them with a weight that Jane understood was intentional. She looked out at the darkening Kansas land, the grass moving in the evening wind, the first stars brightening overhead. "Louis," she said carefully. "I know," he said. "I know the timing is not right, and I know we have known each other less than 2 weeks, and I know you are still grieving your husband. I'm not saying anything you have to answer to. I just want you to know that I think you are the most remarkable woman I have encountered in 30 years of living, and I don't say things I don't mean." She was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the grass with a sound like breathing. "I think you are a very good man," she said at last. "And I don't say things I don't mean either." He looked at her, and the last of the evening light caught his eyes, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the silence between them was not empty but full. "All right," he said, "if you'd allow it." "I would allow it," she said. They walked back to the boarding house in the warm Kansas dark, and at the back porch steps he tipped his hat to her, and she went inside, and she stood for a long time in the small back room with Clara asleep on her cot before she allowed herself to acknowledge what she was feeling. Louis Redmond left Caldwell on a Wednesday morning. Jane was in the dining room when she heard the outfit moving out, the sound of horses and leather and men calling to each other in the early morning. She did not go to the window. She thought about it and then decided against it, because watching him ride away was not the kind of thing she wanted to do casually, as if it were an ordinary sight. She received the first letter 3 weeks later. It arrived on a Thursday, and Mrs. Abernathy handed it to her with an expression of pointed curiosity that Jane did not reward with any information whatsoever. She took the letter to the back room at her first opportunity and sat down on the edge of her cot and broke the seal. Louis wrote the way he spoke, plainly and directly and without ornamentation, but with a precision that meant every word had been selected and placed with care. He wrote that the outfit had made good time back to Texas, that he had ridden out to see the hill country land he had spoken of, that it was 120 acres of creek-fed grassland that needed work but had good bones. He described the land with a specificity and quiet love that told her more about him than anything he might have said directly about himself. He wrote that he had been thinking about Kansas, which was his way of saying he had been thinking about her without overstating the case. He asked how Clara was keeping. He closed by saying he hoped she would write back if she was so inclined. She was inclined. She wrote back that evening at the small desk in the corner of the room, with Clara asleep and the lamp burning low. She told him about Caldwell, about Mrs. Abernathy's temperament, which was difficult, about Pearl, who was kind, about Clara, who had started attending the small schoolhouse on Birch Street, and had informed Jane with great seriousness that she was the best reader in her year, which Jane suspected was accurate. She wrote about the difficulty of building a life in a cattle town, about the loneliness of it sometimes, about the beauty of the Kansas prairie in the early morning when the light came in low and turned everything golden. She told him she had been thinking about Texas. It was a small thing, a single sentence near the bottom of the page, but she read it back to herself twice before she sealed the letter, and both times she felt her heart beat a little faster, and she sent it anyway. The letters went back and forth through the autumn and into the winter, growing longer and more candid as the weeks passed. Louis wrote about the land he was working to acquire, the negotiations with the previous owner, a rancher named Caldwell, unrelated to the town, who was moving his family to Colorado. He wrote about the work of building something from the ground up, and the satisfaction of it, and the loneliness of doing it alone. He wrote about his family in the hill country, his mother and two of his sisters who still lived in the area, his brothers who had scattered, one to New Mexico and one to California. Jane wrote about her life in Missouri before the move west, about Thomas with a candor and honesty that surprised her, the good and the difficult both, the way a genuine marriage is never only one thing. She wrote about what she hoped for Clara, an education and a life with more options than Jane herself had been handed. She wrote about what she hoped for herself, in careful, measured language, because she was not the kind of woman who was extravagant with hope. In December, she received a letter that was different from the others. It was longer and more carefully written, and she could feel the effort in every sentence, the way he had turned the words over and considered them before setting them down. He wrote that he had secured the land. He wrote that the house on it was small but structurally sound, and that it had 3 rooms and a good stone fireplace and a creek visible from the front porch. He wrote that the hill country in December was nothing like Missouri or Kansas, that the winters were mild and the land was gentle, and the sky went on in every direction without interruption. And then he wrote, "I think you know what I am working toward in saying all of this. I would not ask you to decide anything quickly or without consideration, but I think I have felt certain about this since the night I sat with you on that back porch and watched Clara explain her stick town to me, and I have not felt certain about much else in my adult life, and I trust the feeling. If you are willing to consider the possibility, I would like to come back to Caldwell in the spring and speak to you properly about what I am hoping for." Jane read the letter 3 times. Then she set it face down on the desk and went to the kitchen and asked Pearl if she could have a cup of coffee, and Pearl looked at her face and made coffee and did not ask a single question, which was one of the many reasons Jane loved Pearl. She went back to the room and picked up the letter and read it again. She thought about Thomas, carefully and honestly, the way she had made a habit of doing. She thought about grief, and about time, and about the particular kind of loneliness that had been her constant companion since April. She thought about what it meant to be a woman alone in 1878 in a cattle town, with a 6-year-old daughter and a $4-a-week job, and no family within 500 miles. And then she thought about a man sitting quietly in a wooden chair through the long night of a child's fever, rising to hand her a damp cloth without being asked, speaking plainly about his mother and the hard truth of frontier raising, not asking for credit or thanks or any acknowledgement at all. She wrote back that same evening. She said yes. Not to the marriage, not yet, because there were conversations that had to happen face to face, and she was not a woman to rush the things that mattered. But yes to his coming in the spring. Yes to the conversation he was asking for. Yes, in the way that contained all the other yesies that might follow from it, if they both still felt what she believed they felt when the miles between them had been removed. Louis arrived in Caldwell on the first warm day of March 1879. She saw him coming down the main street from the window of the boarding house dining room, and her heart did something embarrassing and immediate that she was grateful no one could see. He was riding a good bay horse she had not seen before, and he sat it with the easy assurance of a man who had spent more of his life on horseback than on the ground. He had gotten a haircut and shaved, and he was wearing his best shirt, which she could tell because he wore it with the particular self-consciousness of someone in clothes reserved for occasions. He tied the horse at the post and came to the front door of the boarding house, and she met him in the corridor before Mrs. Abernathy could intercept him and make the situation strange. "Hello, Louis," she said. "Hello, Jane," he said. It was the first time he had used her first name, and she felt it land in her chest with a quiet, specific weight. He had coffee with her in the dining room, and Clara came in from her morning and stopped in the doorway when she saw him, and after a moment of solemn assessment she walked over to him and said, "You came back," as if this were a conclusion she had reached through careful reasoning. "I did," Louis said. "Good," Clara said simply, and went to get herself a biscuit from the kitchen, apparently satisfied. Jane caught Louis's eye across the table and felt something that was purely uncomplicated joy, something she had not felt so cleanly in a long time. They spent 3 days talking. Long conversations, honest ones, about the things that mattered and the things that were difficult and the realities of what she would be stepping into. He took her out to the edge of town and told her about the land in the hill country with his hands moving as he talked, drawing the geography of it in the air, the creek and the pasture and the wood line to the north, and she listened and asked real questions and tried to see it the way he saw it. She told him about the things she needed. She needed Clara to have a school, or the means of schooling her at home. She needed to know that her word in the running of the household would be respected, that she was not trading one kind of constrained life for another. She said these things directly and without apology because she was 27 years old and she had been managing her own survival for almost a year, and she knew the value of speaking plainly. He listened to every word she said. He nodded. He said, yes, and yes, and yes. On the evening of the second day, they sat on the back porch of the boarding house, the same porch where they had first really spoken, and the air was warm with the first real warmth of spring, and the sky above Caldwell was doing something extraordinary with light and cloud that made the flat prairie look briefly like the surface of another world. "I keep thinking about the night Clara was sick," he said. "So do I," she said. "I wasn't trying to be anything particular," he said. "I just couldn't walk away from it. From you sitting there in that doorway looking like you were holding yourself together by the thinnest thread, with that empty bucket. I couldn't walk away from that." "I'm glad you didn't," she said softly. He turned to look at her. In the evening light his eyes were very clearly green. "Jane," he said, "I would like to marry you, if you'll have me. Not because I think you need someone to manage things for you, because you plainly do not, but because I think we would make something good together, and because I have thought of very little besides you for the past 6 months, and because life is short and I know my own mind." She looked back at him steadily, this man who had sat with her child through the whole terrible night and never once asked for a word of thanks, who had written her letters full of honest prairie-colored words, who crouched in the dust to talk to a 6-year-old about her stick civilization. "I'll have you," she said. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and she let him hold it, and they sat like that as the Caldwell evening came down around them, and it felt like the most natural and right thing that had happened to her in a very long time. They were married in Caldwell on the 15th of April, 1879, exactly 1 year and 4 days after Thomas Hayes had died of a burst appendix and left Jane and Clara to navigate the world alone. The ceremony was small, performed by the Baptist minister, with Pearl from the boarding house kitchen as witness, and a trail hand named Dobson who had ridden with Louis and happened to be passing through as the second witness. Mrs. Abernathy was invited and attended, and Jane thought she detected something that might have been approval in the woman's expression, though it was hard to be certain. Clara stood beside her mother during the ceremony in her best dress, which Jane had let her choose, And when the minister said the words that made Louis Redmond her mother's husband, Clara reached up and took Louis's hand with the matter-of-fact finality of a child who had made a decision and intended to hold to it. He looked down at her and then at Jane, and Jane saw the thing in his eyes that she had been watching for, the thing that told her everything she needed to know about the kind of father he would be. They left Caldwell 3 days after the wedding. Jane had given Mrs. Abernathy 2 weeks' notice and had trained Pearl's niece, a young woman from the edge of town, to take over her duties. She packed their small trunk with the same clothes they had arrived with and a few additions, a quilt Pearl had given her as a wedding gift, a small collection of books she had gathered during her time at the boarding house, the letters Louis had written over the winter. The journey south to the Texas Hill Country took 11 days by wagon, through Indian Territory and into North Texas, and then west and south into the particular landscape Louis had described in his letters. She watched it change as they traveled, the flat Kansas plain giving way to the rolling contours of the Texas land, the cedar and live oak coming in, the limestone outcroppings emerging from the red earth, the creek country opening up around them with its particular green quality, as if the land were lit from somewhere beneath the surface. Clara, who had been quiet and watchful for most of the journey, sat up very straight when they came over the last rise and saw the property spread out below them in the late afternoon light, the creek a silver line through the green pasture, the small house sitting solid and square at the edge of a stand of live oaks, the smoke coming from the stone chimney because Louis had arranged for a neighbor to lay a fire before their arrival. "Is this ours?" Clara asked. "It's ours," Louis said. "All of it. Every acre." Clara was quiet for a moment, taking the full measure of this information. Then she said, "I'm going to need a horse." Louis looked at Jane, and Jane looked at Louis, and between them passed the specific laughter of two people who have just recognized that they are in this together for the duration, and that the duration is going to be exactly this kind of thing, endlessly and wonderfully. "We'll see about a horse," Louis said. The house was small, but Louis had not overstated its quality. 3 rooms, a main room with the stone fireplace and the kitchen area, a bedroom, and a smaller room that would be Clara's. The floors were pine plank, worn smooth with age but solid underfoot. The windows faced south and west, which meant the afternoon light came in long and warm, turning the interior the color of honey. Jane stood in the center of the main room for a long moment after Louis carried their trunk inside, just standing still and feeling the quality of the place, the solidity of it, the way it smelled of cedar and wood smoke and something older and less definable, the smell of land that had been lived on. "What do you think?" Louis asked from the doorway, watching her. "I think we're going to need curtains," she said, "and a better table, and I want a garden in the spring." "All of that," he said, "is entirely possible. Then I think it's going to be a good home," she said. She turned to look at him, standing in the doorway of the first house she had lived in since Missouri, and the late Texas light was behind him, and she felt, with a sudden and complete certainty, that whatever had been lost in the past year, whatever grief and fear and hardship had been required to arrive at this particular moment, it had brought her here, to this man in this place, and she was not willing to regret the road that led to here. The first year in the hill country was not easy, because nothing in that time and place was ever easy, but it was good in the way that work shared between two people who respect each other is good, the kind of goodness that is built rather than simply present. They planted a kitchen garden in May, Jane deciding what to grow and Louis turning the soil and building the fence to keep the deer out. They bred their small herd of cattle through the summer, Louis working the land with the same steady focus he brought to everything, while Jane managed the house and took on sewing work from the women of the small community of ranching families spread across the surrounding hills, because $4 worth of habit died hard, and she was not interested in being idle. Clara attended a small school in the nearest town, Fredericksburg, 6 miles down the road, 3 days a week on the horse Louis had indeed purchased for her, a small, sensible brown mare that Clara named Josephine and treated with a reverence usually reserved for royalty. She was reading well above her level and had developed a passion for mathematics that puzzled and delighted both her mother and Louis in equal measure. She had taken to calling Louis by his first name, which was his suggestion, because he said he had not earned the title of father yet and intended to earn things properly. She called him Louis for approximately 4 months, and then one morning at breakfast she called him Papa with no preamble or explanation, and went back to eating her cornmeal. And Louis looked at Jane over Clara's head, with an expression that Jane recognized as the one he wore when he was feeling something too large to fit into his usual composure. He excused himself to check on the horses directly after breakfast, and when he came back 20 minutes later his eyes were slightly red, and he was otherwise entirely normal, and no one mentioned it. Jane found herself happy. It was not a word she had used about herself for some time, and she tested it carefully against the reality of her days, looking for the places where it did not hold. She found them, of course, because happiness in an honest life is never seamless. There were days when she missed Missouri with an ache that had no remedy. There were moments when Thomas was so present in her memory that she had to sit down and wait for the wave of it to pass. There were nights when the loneliness of the frontier hit her sideways, the isolation of the hill country, the miles between their property and the nearest neighboring woman, the absence of the kind of easy female company she had taken for granted in independence. But she brought these things to Louis, and he listened without trying to fix what could not be fixed, and he held her when that was what was needed, and he talked with her when that was what was needed, and he was learning her the way she was learning him, in the patient and ongoing way that people who intend to spend their lives together do. In September of 1879, a situation arose that tested the character of both of them in ways they had not anticipated. A man named Webb Alcott, who owned the property directly to the north of their land, came to their door one afternoon with a dispute about the boundary line between their properties, a line that Alcott claimed ran 20 yards further south than the survey suggested, which would have given him access to the best section of their creek. He was a large, loud man with a temper like a dog on a short chain, and he made his case with the particular aggressive certainty of a man who was accustomed to getting his way through volume and intimidation. Louis heard him out completely, without interruption. Then he said, with perfect quietness, that he would be happy to have the survey documents examined by the county land office in Fredericksburg, and to abide by whatever the official record indicated. Alcott pressed his case with increasing loudness, implying that Louis's willingness to go to the land office indicated some kind of weakness of character. Louis said, with the same perfect quietness, that he thought Mr. Alcott might want to consider his tone, and that the matter would be settled through legal channels, and that he wished Mr. Alcott a good afternoon. Alcott left in high color and considerable noise. Jane had watched the whole exchange from the doorway of the house, and when Louis came back up the porch steps she said, "That was very well handled." "He's going to be trouble," Louis said without particular alarm. "What will you do?" "Exactly what I said. Go to the land office, have the survey confirmed, stand on the legal ground." He looked at her. "And then, if he continues being trouble, I'll deal with the next thing when it comes." The survey confirmed their boundary. Alcott did not come back to argue it further. They saw him periodically in town, and he regarded them with a cold hostility that Louis returned with perfect cordiality, and Jane matched with an indifference so complete it appeared to frustrate Alcott considerably. The thing Jane understood, watching Louis handle this, and the dozen other small conflicts and difficulties that arose in the course of building a life on frontier land, was that he was not a man who looked for trouble or went around it out of cowardice, but who walked straight through the middle of it with the specific kind of calm that only comes from knowing exactly who you are. In the early winter of 1879, Jane realized she was expecting a child. She told Louis on a Sunday evening sitting by the fireplace after Clara had gone to bed, and she watched his face as the information registered and moved through him. He was very still for a moment. Then he looked at her with an expression that was so open and unguarded that it was almost startling to see on a man who was generally so composed. "You're certain," he said. "As certain as a woman can be at this stage," she said. He reached for her hand and held it in both of his, the way he held his morning coffee cup, like something warm and valuable that he wanted to hold carefully. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "A little," she said honestly. "Clara was a difficult birth. But I know what I'm doing better than I did the first time, and there is a good doctor in Fredericksburg." "We'll get the doctor early," he said. "Well before the time, and Mrs. Hartman. Mrs. Hartman was a German woman 3 properties over who had midwifed half the children in the surrounding hills. We'll plan it properly." "Yes," she said. "Jane," he said. He turned her hand over in his and looked at it for a moment. "I know I'm not Clara's father. I know Thomas was. I don't want to replace what he was to her or to you, but I want to be a good father to this child and to Clara as much as she'll let me be." "You already are," Jane said quietly, "to both of them." He raised her hand and pressed his mouth to the back of it, and she felt the warmth of it all the way through. Their son was born in August of 1880, in the bedroom of the Hill Country House, with Mrs. Hartman in attendance and the doctor from Fredericksburg present, and Louis on the other side of the wall in the main room with Clara, who had been told what was happening, and was managing the information with her characteristic serious composure, and a deep and abiding anxiety that she was concealing with varying degrees of success. The birth was long and difficult in the way that Clara's had been, and Jane gripped Mrs. Hartman's hand and thought about many things during the harder parts of it: the creak outside the window and the sound it made at night, the smell of the live oaks in the evening, the particular way the afternoon light came through the west-facing windows. She thought about Missouri and about Thomas and about the road that had led her here, and she thought about Louis sitting in a wooden chair through the long night of Clara's fever without being asked, and without asking for anything in return. She thought, "I am exactly where I am supposed to be." The boy was born just after midnight, strong-lunged and dark-haired like his father, and Mrs. Hartman laid him in Jane's arms, and Jane looked down at his small, furious face and felt a love so immediate and complete it was like being struck. Louis came into the room when Mrs. Hartman went to fetch him, and he stood in the doorway looking at Jane and the baby, and his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. "Come here," she said. He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby into his arms, and he held the child with the careful reverence of a man who is holding something he cannot quite believe is real. The baby looked up at him with the unfocused, ancient gaze of the newborn, and Louis said something very quietly that Jane almost did not hear. "Hello," he said to his son. Just that. They named him Thomas William Redmond, Thomas for the man who had been Clara's father and the first man Jane had loved, because it was right to honor that, and Louis had said so himself when she raised it tentatively, and William for Louis's father who had died of a fever out on the Texas plains when Louis was 14. Clara came in after very carefully and sat beside her mother on the bed and looked at her brother with the expression of a person confronted with something entirely new and slightly overwhelming. "He's very small," she said. "You were smaller," Jane said. "Is he always going to make that sound?" "For a while," Jane said. Clara considered this. "All right," she said finally, with the tone of someone making a significant concession, and reached out one careful finger to touch the baby's hand, and the baby's fingers closed around her finger with the automatic grasp of the newborn, and Clara's face went through a rapid and beautiful series of expressions before settling into something that looked very much like the beginning of a fierce and lifelong devotion. The years that followed were the years of building, in every sense. The land produced better than they had initially hoped, a combination of Louis's knowledge and care, and 2 good wet springs that filled the creek and kept the pastures lush. They added to the herd carefully and deliberately, refusing to overextend in the way that brought so many frontier ranching operations to their knees. Jane's kitchen garden expanded into a proper kitchen garden, and an orchard of peach and apple trees that Louis planted along the south-facing slope, because she had mentioned once that she missed fresh fruit. She made friends with the women in the surrounding community, a slow and gradual process but a real one, particularly with a woman named Anna Hartman, the midwife's daughter-in-law, who became in time the closest friend Jane had found since leaving Missouri. Anna was a practical, funny, direct woman who shared Jane's opinion that most problems could be managed if you approached them sensibly, and whose company was a particular balm on the days when the isolation of the hill country pressed in. Clara grew with the steady, purposeful velocity of a girl who knew what she wanted. She remained the best reader in any room she occupied, and her talent for mathematics developed into something that several people, including the school teacher in Fredericksburg, suggested was exceptional. By the time she was 11, she was solving problems that the teacher had to think carefully about, and Jane began to supplement her schooling at home with everything she could get her hands on, ordering books from the catalog and writing to a correspondence school in Austin that offered coursework by mail. Thomas William, who became Tommy almost immediately, was a different creature from his sister entirely, expansive and physical where she was contained and intellectual, with a laugh that filled rooms and a disposition toward mischief that was moderated mostly by a fundamental good nature. He followed Louis everywhere on the property from the time he could walk steadily, and Louis took him along with the patient, practical pedagogy of a man who learned by doing and taught the same way, showing him how to read the land and the weather and the cattle, how to maintain tack and mend fence and track water. There was a particular evening in the summer of 1884 when Tommy was 4 and Clara was 11, and the work of the day was done, and the supper things were cleared, and the 4 of them were sitting on the front porch in the long Texas evening light, the hills going purple and gold around them, that Jane allowed herself to fully receive the life she was living. Louis was sitting in the wide wooden chair he had built the second spring, and Tommy was asleep against his side the way small children fall asleep, suddenly and completely, his dark head against his father's arm. Clara was reading on the steps, her feet tucked under her, entirely absorbed. The creak was audible from where they sat, a low, continuous sound like something contentedly murmuring to itself. Jane looked at all of it, at her daughter and her son, and this man who had come to her with an empty bucket in his hand on a night when she had nothing left, and she felt the full and completed shape of the thing her life had become. Louis looked over and caught her looking at him. "What?" said quietly, not wanting to wake Tommy. "Nothing," she said. "Everything." She shook her head slightly. "Do you remember the night Clara was sick, the night we met?" "I remember every part of it," he said. "What made you stay?" she asked. "You could have just handed me the bucket and gone to bed." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the hills. Tommy shifted slightly against him, and Louis put his hand automatically over the boy's shoulder to steady him. "I don't entirely know," he said honestly. "I just knew I couldn't leave. It didn't feel like a decision exactly. It felt like the only thing to do." "It was the only thing to do," she said. "Well," he said, "maybe I knew that." Smiled at him. "Thank you," she said. "For that night I don't think I ever said it properly." He looked at her with those deep-water eyes that she had been looking into for 5 years now and that still sometimes caught her off guard with their particular quality of attention. "You didn't need to," he said. "You never did." She shook her head. "I needed to, not for you, for me." She held his gaze. "Thank you, Louis, for the night with Clara, for the letters, for coming back to Caldwell, for all of it." He held her gaze for a long, quiet moment. "It was my pleasure," he said, and he meant it with every inflection, in all the ways that phrase could mean what it meant. Clara looked up from her book, somehow sensing the particular quality of the silence between her parents, looked at them both, and then went back to her reading with the subtle smile of a girl who understood more than she usually let on. The hill country settled around them in the golden evening, the creek murmuring, the cattle moving in the lower pasture, the peach trees heavy with early fruit along the south slope, and above it all the Texas sky going through its extraordinary evening colors, orange and rose and deep indigo, the stars beginning to emerge one by one as if they too were settling in for the night. In the spring of 1885, Clara turned 12 and announced that she intended to be a school teacher. She made this announcement at the supper table with the quiet finality of someone reporting a decision that was already fully made and required only acknowledgement, not approval. Jane said, "You'll need more schooling than Fredericksburg can offer." Clara said, "I know that." Louis said, "What are you thinking?" Clara had, it emerged, been thinking in considerable detail. She had written to 3 correspondence schools and received their catalogs. She had determined that the state normal school in Huntsville, which trained teachers, was the most logical path. She was too young to attend yet, but she had laid out, with the mathematical precision that characterized her thinking, exactly what she needed to accomplish over the next 5 years to be prepared for it. Jane looked at this child of hers, this serious, purposeful girl who had come through so much in her short life and turned it all, somehow, into fuel for becoming who she meant to be, and she felt a love so fierce it was almost painful. "We'll make it happen," Jane said. Louis said, "Agreed." And then, after a moment, "I'm proud of you, Clara." Clara looked at him across the table, and in her brown eyes, Thomas Hayes's eyes, there was something that was entirely and particularly the look she gave Louis and no one else, the specific look of a child who has been truly seen by someone who didn't have to bother, who chose to. "Thank you, Papa," she said. The name had long since settled into common usage between them, but Louis still received it every time with the same slight shift in his expression, the thing that was not quite a smile but was better than one. Through 1885 and into 1886, the land changed with the cattle industry, as all of Texas changed, the great open-range era giving way under the pressure of fencing and drought and the collapse of cattle prices. Louis watched these changes with the attention of a man who had been in the cattle business long enough to understand how quickly good things could turn, and he diversified their operation before the worst of it hit, moving into crop farming on a portion of the land, planting corn and sorghum, and keeping a more modest but more sustainable cattle operation. They were not wealthy, but they were not in the desperate straits that took some of their neighbors under. Louis's conservatism in the good years meant they had reserves for the leaner ones, and Jane's management of the household expenses with the same shrewd efficiency she brought to everything meant those reserves lasted. There were hard months. There was a drought year when the creek ran low, and they had to haul water for the kitchen garden, and Jane watched the peach trees struggle and felt a specific grief about them that she did not entirely explain even to Louis. There was a winter when Tommy was sick with a chest cold that lasted 3 weeks and frightened Jane in the specific way that a mother of a young child is always frightened by illness, the memory of Clara's fever living permanently somewhere in her body as a reference point for how fast things could go wrong. Louis sat with Tommy through the worst nights of the chest cold, the same way in the same chair, with the same quality of unhurried, watchful attention he had brought to that other sick child in that other room 7 years before. He did not make a thing of it. He simply did it. Jane stood in the doorway one night around 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, and watched Louis sitting with their son, reading by the lamplight while Tommy slept fitfully in the big bed, and she felt the same thing she had felt that first night in Caldwell, that profound and specific gratitude that was too large for the word thank you, but that was what you said anyway because language is imperfect and feeling is not. Tommy recovered fully by early January and attributed his recovery primarily to the stories Louis had told him during the bad nights, which Clara pointed out with acidic accuracy, were factually dubious and emotionally manipulative, which made Tommy laugh, which made him cough, which made Jane tell both of them to stop, which was the full and ordinary music of their household, and she would not have changed a single note of it. In the summer of 1886, there was a drought that baked the hill country into something approaching hardship. And during that summer, Jane had occasion to understand something about the community they had built and its relationship to the wider world. A family of Mexican workers who had been helping a neighbor property through the planting season were let go abruptly when the drought reduced the work available, and found themselves stranded, with 3 children, on the road between their employer's land and the town, with no wages for the weeks they had worked and very little food. Louis brought them into the property without particular ceremony and gave them the use of the small outbuilding near the stable, and whatever the kitchen could spare, while the matter of their unpaid wages was sorted. Jane cooked for them, and Clara, who had been learning Spanish from a book she had ordered, and was at this point competent in the basics, served as an imperfect but willing interpreter. Louis rode to the neighbor's property and had a conversation with the employer that Jane was not present for, but the results of which were a full payment of the owed wages, delivered within 48 hours. He did not explain exactly what was said in that conversation, but the neighbor avoided Louis in town for some time afterward, which Jane thought spoke clearly enough. The family stayed for a week while they arranged their passage south to San Antonio, where they had family. Before they left, the father of the family, a man named Hector, took Louis's hand and held it for a long moment and said something that Clara translated, with the careful concentration of someone working at the edge of their vocabulary, as approximately, "You are a man who does not need to be told what is right." Louis accepted this with a nod and said something in return that Clara translated as, "Safe travels to you and your family," though Jane suspected it was something more than that, and Louis simply chose the easier version. She thought about that for a long time afterward, the way Louis moved through the world, with that particular ethics that was not performed for anyone's benefit and did not require any kind of external validation. He simply saw what needed doing and did it, whether it was carrying water to an empty bucket, or facing down a dishonest neighbor, or feeding a stranded family, or sitting through the entire night with a sick child. She had been married to him for 7 years, and she still sometimes looked at him and felt the particular amazement of someone who has received something they did not expect and still cannot entirely believe. Clara left for Huntsville in the fall of 1888, 17 years old and more prepared than most students the normal school would see in a year. The farewell at the wagon in the morning was the most difficult moment Jane had experienced since Missouri. The specific grief of watching a child you have raised through every trial and triumph climb up onto a wagon seat with her trunk and her books and her serious brown eyes, heading toward the life she had decided to make. Louis stood beside Jane at the gate and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned against him and watched the wagon take her daughter around the first bend in the hill country road and out of sight. "She's going to be magnificent," Louis said. "I know she is," Jane said. "That doesn't make this any easier." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." Tommy, who was 8 and did not fully understand why everyone was sad about Clara leaving, since Clara was often argumentative and always right about it, stood at the fence and waved long after the wagon had disappeared, which made Jane cry in earnest, and Louis hand her his handkerchief and Tommy look between them, both with the baffled sympathy of someone who recognizes the appropriate emotional register, without being entirely sure what has triggered it. They settled into the changed shape of the household without Clara, which was quieter and took some getting used to. Letters came from Huntsville with regularity, long, detailed, characteristically Clara letters, full of observations about her coursework and her fellow students, and the political arguments occurring around her in the world, the women's suffrage movement gathering momentum, the labor questions, the territorial politics that were reshaping the West. Jane wrote back just as regularly, and Louis added a paragraph to each letter in his plain, careful handwriting. Updates on the land and the horses and Tommy's most recent misadventures, and reading his paragraphs between composing her own Jane, thought that the specific quality of love in them was one of the most beautiful things she had ever read. Its restraint and its warmth existing together in the way that genuine feeling does when it has been allowed to settle and ripen. In January of 1890, Jane found herself expecting a second child. She was 39 years old, and this surprised her considerably, though perhaps it should not have. She told Louis in the same spot by the same fireplace on a Sunday evening and watched the same progression move across his face, the stillness, the opening, the unguarded light. "Are you all right?" he asked immediately. "I'm fine," she said. "It's a surprise, but I'm fine." "And you want it?" he asked carefully, because he was always careful with her autonomy. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Do you?" He looked at her with that full, open attention, the thing she had fallen in love with long before she acknowledged she was falling in love. "Yes," he said, "more than I can say." This pregnancy was harder than the others, because she was older and the hill country summer of 1890 was relentless. But she managed it with the same practical determination she brought to everything, slowing down when she needed to and refusing to slow down when she didn't need to, driving Louis into a mild and affectionate frustration on multiple occasions when she insisted on doing something he thought she should leave to him. "Jane," he said one August afternoon when he found her hauling water buckets to the kitchen garden in the full heat. "I'm fine," she said preemptively. "You are stubborn past all reason," he said. "I know," she said pleasantly. "It's one of my best qualities." He shook his head, took the bucket from her hand, and carried it himself, and she walked beside him because she was not going to stop monitoring her own garden, and he knew it. The baby came in September 1890, a girl, healthy and loud, and with Jane's coloring, fair and clear-eyed, emerging into the world with an announcement that could be heard from the front porch. Mrs. Hartman had retired by this point, and her daughter, a capable woman named Frieda, who had been born during one of her mother's own deliveries, and seemed to take the whole business of birth as a personal and professional matter of great pride, attended with the Fredericksburg doctor. Louis was in the main room with Tommy, who was now 10 and had enough understanding to be genuinely frightened by the sounds coming from the bedroom, and Louis talked him through it with a steadiness that Tommy would remember for the rest of his life, not by pretending nothing was happening, but by explaining what was happening with plain and calm honesty. When Frieda came out to get Louis and he walked into the bedroom and saw Jane holding the baby, he looked at her face first, before the baby, the way he always did, checking her. "I'm fine," she said before he could ask. "Come and see your daughter." He sat beside her and she put the baby in his arms, and he looked down at this new small person, and the expression on his face was the same one he had worn for Tommy, for all the children, for every good and significant thing that had ever happened in his life, that quality of wondering disbelief mixed with absolute certainty. "Hello," he said to his daughter. Just that. They named her Margaret Anna, Margaret for Louis's mother and Anna for Jane's friend Anna Hartman, who had been as much a part of their lives in the hill country as anyone not living under their roof. Tommy received the information that he had a sister with a 10-year-old boy's complicated mixture of grudging acceptance and secret fascination, and within 2 weeks was the most assiduous and protective older brother a small girl could want, a role he performed with unself-conscious and absolute conviction for the rest of his life. Clara came home from Huntsville the following spring, now 19 and in her final term, and already corresponding with a school board in Austin about a teaching position. She came home with an armload of books and an account of everything she had been learning that filled the supper table conversation for 3 evenings running, and she sat at the kitchen table with baby Margaret on her lap and held her little sister with the same careful devotion she had first extended to Tommy, and Jane sat across the table and thought about the kind of love that multiplies rather than divides, the way a good life does. Clara saw the property with the eyes of someone returning to something loved from a distance. She walked every part of it that she had known since she was 7, the creek and the pasture and the peach orchard, and she stood for a long time on the front porch looking at the hills, and then she went and sat beside Louis in his wide wooden chair and said, "Thank you for taking care of it." Louis looked at her. "It's your home," he said. "It's yours," she said, "but you've kept it the way it should be. That matters." She paused. "You've always kept things the way they should be." He did not say anything for a moment. The hills were doing what they did in the spring light, going through those endless variations of green that the cedar and the live oak and the new grass produced together. "Your mother did the hard part," he said. "You both did," Clara said. "I know the difference." She looked at him with Thomas Hayes's brown eyes, Thomas whom Louis had never met and whom Jane still carried quietly in the way you carry the people who shaped the beginning of your life. And Louis held her gaze with the full attention that was one of the things Jane loved most about him, and something passed between them that was its own kind of acknowledgement. Clara got the teaching position in Austin. She left in August of 1891, and this farewell was different from the one 3 years before. Not easier exactly, but fuller, because Jane now knew the shape of having a grown child go out into the world, and could hold both the grief and the pride at once without either one undoing the other. Clara wrote magnificent letters always, and Jane kept every one of them in the small box under the bed where she also kept Louis's winter letters from 1878, the ones written from the Texas Hill Country before she had seen it, when it was only a description in plain handwriting of a creek and a pasture and 3 rooms and a stone fireplace. Tommy grew, and the property grew, and Margaret grew, and the years moved in the way that good years move, full and fast and never quite as long as you want them to be. Louis turned 40 in 1889 and took the occasion as an opportunity to remark that he was getting old, which Jane told him was absolutely ridiculous. And then she turned 39 in 1890, and Tommy made a birthday cake with Pearl's recipe, which Pearl had written out for Jane years ago, and which Jane had taught Tommy the previous winter. And the cake was lopsided and magnificent, and Jane told her family that she was the luckiest woman in Texas, which Tommy said was an easily verifiable statistic, and Clara, in her letter, agreed. On an evening in the spring of 1892, with the peach orchard in full bloom and Margaret playing in the yard under the live oaks, and Tommy out in the pasture with the cattle, Louis and Jane sat on the front porch in the wide chairs he had built, and the hill country spread around them in the way it had always spread, generous and unhurried and entirely indifferent to the small but significant events that the people on it called their lives. "Do you remember the first night I cooked for you here?" Jane asked. "I remember everything," Louis said, and she knew he meant it in the specific and complete way he always meant things. "You said the biscuits were good." "They were good," he said. "They were burnt on the bottom, the oven ran hot, and I hadn't learned it yet." "They were good," he said again with a slight smile. She shook her head. "You were being kind." "I was being honest," he said. "They were good enough and you were worried about them and I wanted you to know they were fine." She looked at him. "That's the same thing as being kind." "Sometimes it is," he conceded. Margaret came running up from the yard with a fistful of wildflowers, the indiscriminate purple and yellow ones that grew along the creek, and thrust them at Jane with the jubilant generosity of a 2-year-old. "For you," she announced. Jane took them with the solemnity they deserved. "They're beautiful, my love." "Thank you." Margaret considered this, then turned and thrust a second handful at Louis. "For you," she said. Louis received the flowers with the same gravity. "Thank you, Miss Margaret." Margaret, satisfied with the distribution of flowers, turned and ran back down to the yard with the tottering certainty of a child who is running not toward anything in particular, but simply for the pleasure of running, and Louis and Jane watched her go. They were quiet together for a long moment, the way 2 people are quiet together when they have built enough shared life that silence between them is a comfortable and companionable thing, rather than an absence of something. "Louis," Jane said. He said, watching Margaret in the yard. "I keep thinking about that night, the night with Clara." She paused. "I've thought about it all these years." He looked over at her. "What about it? You never expected anything from it," she said. "You never asked for anything. You just sat there through the whole terrible night because it was the right thing to do, and then you walked away." She looked at him. "I don't know many people who operate that way." "You operate that way," he said. "I try to," she said. "It's why we suited each other," he said simply. She reached across and put her hand on his, and he turned his hand over and held hers in both of his, the way he had always held things he valued, with care and without show. "I love you," she said. It was not the first time she had said it, not by a long measure, but some moments required it to be said again because it was true again with a new and specific fullness, and this was one of those moments. "I love you," he said back, "more than I have ever been able to properly say." "You say it fine," she told him. "I say it plainly," he said. "I'm not sure that's the same thing." "For you," she said, "it is." He smiled at her, the full smile, the one that transformed his composed and weathered face into something younger and clearer, the smile she had been receiving for 14 years and had never once taken for granted. The evening settled over them, the peach blossoms scenting the air, the creek murmuring its eternal commentary from below the south slope, the hills holding their immovable and beautiful positions against the Texas sky. Margaret laughed at something in the yard, and Louis and Jane both turned to look at her, their daughter in the wildflower grass, her small arms spread wide for no reason except that the world was large and she was in it. Clara was in Austin teaching 37 children their letters and their sums, and the shape and consequence of the world they were inheriting. Tommy was in the lower pasture in the last of the afternoon light, learning the land the way his father had taught him, with his hands and his attention and his steady daily presence. And here were Louis and Jane, on the porch of the house that had started as 3 rooms and a stone fireplace, and had grown, as everything they touched grew, into something real and rooted and full. In the years that followed, the pattern of their life deepened into the kind of thing that does not need to be called happiness, because it simply is the substance of a life lived well, the ordinary extraordinary accumulation of seasons and meals and conversations and seasons again, the creek high in spring and low in summer, the peach trees heavy and then bare and then budding again, the cattle coming and going, the children growing and coming home and growing more. Clara did indeed prove to be magnificent. She taught in Austin for 4 years and then was made head of her school at the age of 23, which caused a brief but pointed discussion with the school board that her mother followed with intense interest from the letters she received, and which Clara resolved with a combination of academic evidence and the particular iron-spined pleasantness she had inherited from Jane and honed entirely on her own. She married at 25. A man named Robert Ellison, who was a lawyer in Austin with a gentle disposition, and the specific quality of listening with full attention that Jane recognized immediately, because she had seen it every day for 15 years in a different man. Clara brought him to the hill country for the first time in the summer of 1896, and Jane watched Louis and Robert shake hands on the front porch and saw Louis assess him in the quiet way he assessed everything. And later, when they were washing up in the kitchen, Louis said to Jane, "He's a good man," in the tone that meant he had looked carefully and found no evidence to the contrary. "I know," Jane said. "She would not have chosen him if he weren't." Louis considered this. "No," he said. "She wouldn't have. Tommy did not leave the hill country." It was perhaps predictable that he would not, the boy who had followed Louis through the pastures since he could walk, who knew every inch of the land by the time he was 15, who understood the cattle and the creek and the particular way the weather came in from the northwest in winter. He took on more and more of the running of the property as Louis moved into his 50s, not out of any diminishment on Louis's part, but out of a natural and mutual recognition that this was what made sense, and Louis taught him with the same patient and complete attention he brought to everything. At 20, he fell in love with the oldest daughter of a ranching family in the next valley over, a tall, direct young woman named Catherine, who was as capable on horseback as Tommy and considerably more organized, and who made it quietly clear that she expected to be a partner in the running of any household she entered, and not simply an ornament to it. Jane recognized this quality immediately and approved of it completely. Louis shook her father's hand and then shook Catherine's hand and told her she was welcome in their home and on their land for as long as she chose to be there. Tommy and Catherine married in 1900, the turn of the century, in the small church in Fredericksburg that the family had attended for 20 years, and Jane sat in the front pew beside Louis with Margaret on her other side, now 10 years old and arrayed in the best dress Jane could make her, taking the ceremony in with the grave focus of a child who understood that this was important even if all the details were not yet fully clear. Margaret, in the fullness of time, became the surprise of the family, not a teacher like Clara or a rancher like Tommy, but a doctor. She announced this intention at the age of 14 with the same calm finality that Clara had announced her intention to teach, and Jane felt the same combination of complete belief and logistical consternation. "A woman doctor," Louis said that evening, not as a challenge but as a statement of something he was turning over carefully. "There are women doctors," Jane said, "more than there used to be." "There are," he agreed. "What does she need?" That was always his question, not whether. What does she need? What Margaret needed was considerable and took considerable arrangement, but she was a Redmond child in the fullest sense, which meant she combined Clara's intellectual ferocity with Tommy's practical determination, and Jane's refusal to be stopped by obstacles that were only obstacles and not genuine impossibilities. She studied in Austin, and then in St. Louis, came home periodically to the hill country, where the peach trees had been producing for 20-some years, and Louis's hair had gone entirely gray, and the creek still ran clear over the limestone bed, and she brought her medical knowledge with her, and applied it to everything she could reach, including, on one memorable occasion, a difficult calving that Tommy had been struggling with for an hour. Tommy said afterward that he was going to start paying her a ranch hand's wages, and Margaret said she would accept nothing less than a senior partner's fee, and Louis watched his children argue about this across the supper table, and looked at Jane with the expression she knew as one of complete and settled satisfaction. On an evening in 1905, when Louis was 56 and Jane was 54, and the hill country had settled into autumn again with its particular amber light, Louis and Jane walked down to the creek. After supper the way they had been walking down to the creek in the evenings for more than 25 years. The creek was low with the dry September, running clear and quiet over the stones, and the live oaks along the bank were doing their autumn thing, which in the hill country was a subtle softening of the green rather than the dramatic color change of northern trees, the light coming through the leaves with a golden quality that made everything look as if it were lit from within. Louis and Jane stood on the bank and listened to the water, and Jane put her hand through his arm the way she always did, and he covered her hand with his the way he always did. She thought about the girl she had been in 1878, standing in the doorway of a boarding house with an empty bucket, frightened and exhausted and entirely alone. She thought about what that girl could not have known, about the long road and the letters and the hill country house and the 3 children and 26 years of a man who did what was right without asking for anything in return. "Louis," she said. He said, "I want to say something." He looked at her. "I have spent 26 years being grateful to you," she said. "Not just for that night, though always for that night, for everything, for the kind of man you are, for the way you have loved me and Clara and the children. For all of it." She looked up at him. "I don't say it enough." "You say it plenty," he said. "Not as much as I feel it," she said. He looked at her with the creek-water eyes, the deep-water eyes that had first looked at her out of the dark on that back porch, and she could see everything in them that had always been there and everything that had been added by the years, the fullness and the weight of a life genuinely lived. "Jane Hayes," he said, using her maiden name the way he sometimes did, as a kind of reverence, "you have given me the best life I could have imagined. You are the finest person I have ever known. And every single thing I have done or been in these 26 years, I would do again and again and again without a moment's hesitation. She leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and they stood by the creek in the autumn evening of the Texas hill country, and the water moved over the stones with its low, continuous sound, and the live oaks held their positions against the amber sky, and everything was, as far as either of them could tell, exactly as it should be. Clara came home for Christmas that year with Robert and their 2 boys, Thomas and John, now 7 and 5, who ran the full length of the property with Tommy's children, in the manner of children who have been given an entire ranch to play in and intend to use every inch of it. Margaret came from Austin with her medical bag and her opinions about everything and her particular gift for making everyone around her feel simultaneously assessed and cared for, which Jane recognized as the highest possible compliment because it described Louis exactly. On Christmas evening, the whole family sat in the main room of the Hill Country House, the fireplace going, the smell of pine and baking and something that Jane could only call home, and Louis sat in his wide chair by the fire with Tommy's youngest on his lap, 3 years old and already asleep, and he looked across the crowded, warm room at Jane and she looked back at him. 14 people in the room, 3 generations. 27 years of a life built from a single act of unrequested kindness in a cattle town in Kansas. A man who came to the door of a back porch at 9 o'clock at night and took a bucket from a frightened woman's hand and stayed through the whole dark night until everything was going to be all right. Jane raised her coffee cup slightly, a small private toast. Louis smiled, the full smile, and raised his own. Outside the Hill Country House the December night was clear and cold and full of stars, the creek too low for much sound in the dry winter, the peach trees bare-branched along the south slope, dormant and waiting in the way that things wait when they are certain that spring will come, as it has always come, as it always will. Inside, the fire burned and the family breathed together, all of them here, all of them whole, the work of 27 years visible in every face in that warm room. And Jane Hayes Redmond looked at all of it and held it in her chest and knew that she would carry every piece of it with her. Every letter and every fever night and every morning on the porch and every walk to the creek, and every biscuit burnt on the bottom, and every wildflower delivered in a small serious hand, for the rest of her days. She would carry it and it would be more than enough. It would be everything.